Hello, children. This is Grandma Carla with Abby Lost at Sea, Chapter 9. Remember, the last time we saw Abby and Luke, they had been tossed overboard in the storm and were bailing water out of their little boat. Abby's arm shook as she handed Luke the empty bucket. It had grown so heavy in the last few minutes she could not lift it one more time. "I'll finish," he said. "There's not much water left." The bobbing of the jolly boat had lessened since the storm had ended. Abby could see Luke outlined against the dark gray sky. The clouds were clearing. She could see some stars and a slight glow from the eastern horizon. Luke threw out the last half bucket of water and set the can back on the stern. "Hey, I almost forgot. There's a mast and a sail stowed under the benches," he said. "When it gets light, I'll see if I can rig it up. Maybe the wind will carry us to land." Abby heard the hopeful note in his voice. Luke always loved a challenge. He had the supreme confidence that he could get out of any jam. "I suppose that's because he's strong. His body has never failed him. But our only chance now depends on the right winds and the very breath of God," Abby thought. Then she realized with a start that she hadn't prayed yet. She had been too busy just surviving. She shivered as the pre-dawn breeze and wrapped her arms in She shivered in the pre-dawn breeze and wrapped her arms about her middle in an effort to warm up. Her blue chambray dress was still wet, although the breeze now blew a warm tropical air on her. Luke looked over from his seat in the stern and then joined her. "Are you still cold?" he asked. She nodded. "Me too," he said as he put his arm around her. Abby gazed up at his green and gold speckled eyes. "I guess if I had to be lost at sea, I couldn't find a better friend for it," she said. He smiled at her. "We are in it deep, but at least I'm not living with Aunt Dagmar." Abby returned the smile for the first time in hours. "At least we're living, period." Luke agreed. Would you pray with me?" Abby asked. He looked down at his hand. "You pray for both of us, all right?" She sighed and closed her eyes. God had helped them stay in the skiff, but would he bring them safely to land? The ocean looked so big, and their situation seemed so overwhelming. For the first time in her life, Abby was separated from her ma and pa. She might not ever see her family again. Emotions clogged her throat. The little boat rocked on the wide, wide sea surrounding them. She sat wishing for something to hang on to, for some anchor of safety. Her parents were miles away. With a shock, Abby saw how much she'd always depended on the security of their presence. "Why, I've always taken it for granted that they would be there to help me out. And when they couldn't fix something, I've always let them pray for me. That means I've taken God for granted too. But now God is the only one who can help me." As that realization hit, words from her mother's past readings flooded through her mind. "He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea were hushed." It was the anchor in the wide loneliness that Abby needed, for she could see that he had stilled the storm. Suddenly she knew what to pray. "Thank you, God, for helping us so far. Please get us to land soon, and don't let Ma and Pa worry too much. Amen." Luke looked toward the east. "Sun's coming up. We'll be glad to have a piece of that old tarp around us with us today." "Why's that?" Abby asked, stifling a yawn. "The tropical sun burns deep. You'll need to cover your skin till it gets used to it." Luke bent down and inspected the circular grove in the bottom of the boat. "Now that it's getting lighter, I think I'll see to the mast and the sail." He handed her the ripped tarp. "Why don't you wrap up in this and see if you can get some sleep? I'll take first watch." Abby settled down in the bow of the boat. Her worry had lightened since she had prayed. Luke looked up at the small sail, stretched tightly against the sky. The mast had fit snugly into the groove made for it. It hadn't taken too long to rig up the sail, a job that had come back to him from long ago when he had sailed on Quaker Lake with his pa. By the time the sun spilled its honey light over the sleepy sea, the little jolly boat had captured a northeasterly wind. The boat scuttled along on the low swells. Whether or not they were headed toward a distant shore, Luke did not know, but he hoped so. He looked over at Abby, fast asleep, and curled up in the bow. Her tea-colored hair blew softly over the white tarp. After his ma, Abby was the kindest person he'd ever known. She always thought about others. Sometimes she drove him nuts when she'd recite poetry or stop right in the middle of things to draw a picture. But I guess that's what makes her Abby. In spite of her leg weakness, she's got spunk. If she'd let go when I went over the side of the skiff, I don't think I could have made it back. The waves were too strong. He remembered how the waves almost sucked him out of her grasp. If they had, he would have eventually tired and drowned in the stormy sea. He shuddered at the thought. And that wasn't the first time that she'd rescued him, he reflected. There'd been those first days in Pueblo de San Jose, right after he'd arrived from Pennsylvania. His aunt's hard heart and a bunch of new faces at school had overwhelmed him in his grief over losing his ma and pa. But then Abby turned her beaming smile on him. It was like this very morning's light after the storm, he thought, grinning as he looked down at her. You don't know it, Abby Kendall, but I think you're pretty great for a girl. Abby! Abby's eyes opened at the sound of Luke's voice. She saw the blue sky overhead and a white triangle sail pinned to it. She heard the lap, lap, lap of the waves against the boat's gunwales and felt the steady rocking of the boat. Abby sighed in warm contentment and stretched. When she glanced over at Luke, she sat up in surprise. What are you doing out in the open? She asked. Oh, the night storm came flooding back to her. They were no longer on the Intrepid, but lost at sea. Luke's green eyes were laced with red lines. I'm trying to keep our little vessel near the coast, he answered, but I think the rudder might have been damaged when we went overboard. His hand rested on the tiller that guided the unseen rudder. Abby's eyes followed his glance, and she saw the green coastline to their left. Oh, thank God. Luke, we're going to be all right. He smiled at her. We need to beach somewhere so we can try to find water. I am dog-tired. I've got to lay down for a bit. She saw the exhaustion in his face. Can I take it for a while? I don't think so. There's a strong current fighting this rudder. I'm using all my strength to hold her steady, but luckily we've got a good breeze pushing us forward. When we come on the next stretch of white sand, we'll try to land. All right, she agreed. Abby cautiously rose and moved toward him with the tarp. You've let me rest in the shade. Now it's your turn to keep the sun off. She draped the tarp over his right shoulder, where his forearm was exposed to the sun. She could see the bright red tinge there. Thanks, Luke grinned. I'm glad you got some rest. How long did I sleep? A few hours, I think. Abby glanced around. The sun overhead poured down on the deep. She could see light rays descending into the sapphire water below them. When she looked to her right, she gasped. Several miles away, another island rose majestically from the ocean. Look, there's land in that direction too. Luke laughed. I noticed, but I don't have a clue where we are. Remember Uncle Samuel sent us a map of the islands of Hawaii on the back of his letter, Abby asked thoughtfully. When we studied them the night you came for dinner, I noticed that most of the islands are miles apart. But Maui, Lani, and Molokai make up a triangle because they're set close together. The island to our left must be one of them. You're right, Luke gazed at the green island. We were traveling toward Oahu, but the storm must have pushed us south. Just then, Abby gasped. Look, a beach up ahead. Great, Luke said, but then he pointed the vessel seaward. You're heading out to sea, she exclaimed. We have to head out in order to tack back towards shore, he explained. In a few minutes he tacked, and the boom on the skiff swung to the starboard. The jolly boat spread over the swells toward the glistening beach. Abby leaned forward in anticipation. Would they find water or islanders to help? As they neared the beach, she noticed a lacy fringe of waves crossing the small bay toward which they aimed. At the moment, she heard Luke say, "Jehoshaphat!" "What is that?" she asked, frowning. "It looks like a reef, one of those coral reefs your uncle wrote about in his letter." As they drew near, they could see the waves dancing over the top of the reef. "Will the boat ride over it?" Abby asked. Her stomach grew taut with worry. What if the boat capsized and threw them out? What if they were tossed onto the sharp coral, cut open, and became lunch for the big, hungry reef shark? "I don't know," Luke said, never taking his eyes off the approaching waves, which were heaving over the barrier. "But if the boat tips, be ready to dive over." There was no time to answer, for the ocean suddenly swelled under them and lifted them into the churning waves. Abby gripped the gunwale and hailed on. The little skiff lifted higher and ran with the wave. Just as she thought they were over it, the boat bottom crunched on the coral and was caught. The little vessel shuddered in the ocean surge. "The rudder," Luke said, his arm flailing back and forth as he worked the tiller. "We've lost the rudder." The corals knocked it clean off. As the next set of waves surged over the coral, the sea lifted the boat up and over the coral. The wind pushed against the sail and carried them swiftly toward the beach. The white sand glowed brightly in the noonday sun. Farther up the beach, trees swayed in the trade winds. Abby remembered Uncle Samuel had called them coconut trees. Then the skiff surged with the tide onto the sand, and Luke leapt out and pushed the gunwale, guiding the boat to higher ground. Abby jumped out after him. Even though her skirts clung to her in knee-deep water, she helped push the skiff up higher into the sand. "We made it!" she yelled joyfully. Luke grinned along with her, and she noticed that he was swaying with the breeze, just like the trees. "You better lay down in the shade and get some rest," she said. "I'll take this watch." She retrieved the tarp from the boat and laid it under a coconut tree for him. Luke mumbled thanks and fell asleep, almost before his head touched the canvas. Abby watched his hair blow in the trade winds. "He deserves a good rest," she thought. "I hope he sleeps for a few hours." Sitting beside him, she unlaced her ankle-high boots and removed them, along with her stockings. She wrinkled her toes in the sugar-like sand. Then she wandered back down to the water's edge. The ocean wasn't chilly as it was near California. In the shallow, warm waves frothed over her feet. Her toes sank softly into the golden sand. She bent down and washed her face with the water and almost rinsed her mouth out with it, but then she remembered salt water could make her even thirstier than she already was. The water jar had been somehow lost in the storm. "Maybe I can find a coconut and break it open. Uncle Samuel claims there's nothing sweeter than the milk of a ripe coconut." Abby felt a surge of hope. "We could live off coconuts if we have to. Maybe we could repair the jolly boat too, and somehow we'll find my family again." Well, things are just getting very exciting, aren't they, in Abby Lost at Sea? So next time we'll read Chapter 10. This is Grandma Carla, and I'll see you next time.